In Canada, maple syrup is king. Well, King Charles is also king, but maple syrup isn't too far behind. And in the heart of Quebec, between 2011 and 2012, where maple syrup flows like liquid gold, a gang of robbers orchestrated the disappearance of 18 million Canadian dollars worth of the syrupy treasure. Get ready for a tale where the strange pursuit of maple gold takes a turn into the world of the, I can't believe I'm saying this, black market maple syrup trade. Welcome to Capers and Cocktails, a true crime podcast that doesn't take itself too seriously and gives you something to enjoy while you listen. The following content may be disturbing to some. Discretion is advised. If you're enjoying one of our themed cocktails, ensure you're of legal drinking age and have fun, but drink responsibly. Maple syrup is made from the sap of sugar maple trees. The process of making maple syrup is known as sugaring or maple sugaring. The production season is relatively short, typically lasting just a few weeks. Tapping the trees begins late winter or early spring when the sap begins to flow. Sugar maple trees are tapped by drilling a small hole into the trunk, and a spout or tap is inserted to collect the sap. Sap flows from the tree into buckets or through tubing connected to the taps. The sap is a clear, watery liquid at this stage. The collected sap is then boiled down to remove water content and concentrate the sugars. This is typically done in a sugar house, often called a sugar shack. Then it is officially syrup. Maple syrup is used in a variety of culinary applications. It's commonly used as a topping for, well, you guys know, pancakes, waffles, and French toast. According to Simon Trapanier, the executive director of the Federation of Maple Syrup Producers, quote, "Maple syrup for Quebecers is not part of only our culture, but it's running through our veins," end quote. And today, it will be the star of both our crime and our drink. For the cocktail, muddle an orange wheel in the bottom of a glass. To that muddled orange, add a half a part maple syrup, a half a part orange juice, and a fourth part lemon juice. Then add 2 parts bourbon and stir well. Top the drink with ice and seltzer. For the mocktail, you'll do all the same steps, just replacing the bourbon with a non-alcoholic whiskey of your choice. I say this every time, but I linked my favorite in the description box. Once you've topped with the ice and seltzer, enjoy a... Maple syrup in Canada is controlled by a legally sanctioned cartel. Yes, I said those words out loud, and it's not an exaggeration. The Federation of Maple Syrup Producers. Quebec is known as the Saudi Arabia of maple syrup, producing between 70 and 80% of the world's supply, and the Federation is basically OPEC. The Federation employs strict control to keep the prices of maple syrup stable. There's an enforced quota that controls how much producers can make each season. If there's a bounty year of maple syrup production, the excess is stored in Canada's Global Strategic Reserve. If there's a low year of production, they'll release those stored barrels of maple syrup into the market, keeping the prices relatively stable. The Global Strategic Reserve has been described as the Fort Knox of Canada, which I'm not sure about because Fort Knox has never been burglarized, but I guess I'll let the Canadians have this one. I don't know. The Federation rents space in various barns and warehouses throughout Quebec, and they conduct annual inspections of the spaces to ensure the inventory is there and safe. And one white 55-gallon barrel of Canadian maple syrup in the Global Strategic Reserve is worth around $1,800, which actually ends up being about 30 times the price of a barrel of oil. Each barrel is 600 pounds of liquid gold. Some maple syrup producers are fine with the Federation. They like the stability. But for others, well, at least one maple syrup producer was quoted as saying the Federation runs a, quote, regime of terror, end quote. The Federation controls who can buy and who can sell. And if you want to sell maple syrup as an individual with some sugar maple trees, well, you have to work with the Federation. There are some rebels out there, but generally, you better bow down to the Federation if you want to sell your syrup. If you don't, it'll cost you. We're talking small family farms with giant 50,000 plus fines if they choose to sell outside of the Federation. It's a little bit hard to pinpoint exactly when this crime took place due to the nature of the crime, but in the few months spanning 2011 to 2012, a group of men with sticky fingers decided that instead of robbing a bank, maple syrup was the only bank they needed. In what the Vancouver Sun dubbed the, quote, sweetest heist of all time, end quote, these syrup swindlers rented a forklift, went into the St. Louis de Blandford warehouse, picked up barrel after barrel after barrel, and took them to a processing facility, otherwise known as a sugar shack. There, they emptied the barrels, processed them into smaller portions, and sold those smaller portions to exporters. They then took the empty barrels, filled them with water, and returned them to the warehouse, where if they were audited, and they were often audited, no one would be any the wiser. And it may have worked, at least for a long time, except that demand for the black market syrup started to increase. And it was hard for the syrup siphoners to keep up with it. So they started just emptying the barrels and not replacing the syrup with water. The jig was up when a Federation auditor came to the warehouse in July 2012 to start the yearly inventory and attempted to climb on a barrel. The barrel turned out to be empty and startled the auditor by toppling right over. In August of 2012, the Federation reported to the police that there was a theft at their Fort Knox. Quebec police launched the largest probe in the province's history with around 250 investigators. It took them 2 weeks just to determine which of the barrels were emptied. They eventually figured out that the warehouse had lost 9,561 barrels of syrup, which is the equivalent of 18 million Canadian 2012 dollars, which is coincidentally about 18 million 2023 American dollars. It was the biggest theft ever in Quebec. CTV News reported that, quote, the stolen amount would have provided a 1 tablespoon topping for a whopping 183 million flapjacks, end quote. Suspects were hard to come by at first. The authorities interviewed over 200 potential witnesses throughout the syrup supply chain. It was pretty clear from the beginning that this had to be an insider job. It had to be someone with unfettered access to the warehouse to be able to, well, carry off such a large crime in such a relatively short period of time. It's a lot of barrels, 600 pounds, like almost 10,000 barrels. They found fingerprints, footprints, and scratched barrels in that warehouse. The scratched barrels were actually a big clue because it showed that whoever did this used a different kind of forklift to lift the barrels, as the one used officially in the warehouse was designed on purpose to avoid scratching the barrels. So that ended up being a big clue. Finally, after a months-long multi-jurisdictional search and the seizure of 2/3 of the stolen syrup, they were able to get that much back. People were apprehended in connection with the maple syrup mugging. One, Richard Vallier, was a likely suspect. He was already known for selling maple syrup on the black market. He was, according to his attorney, quote, the most known barrel roller in Quebec, end quote. Even though it's not really allowed, producers often sell what they make over the Federation's quota to barrel rollers, black market guys who are the middlemen between the producers and exporters. And the thing is, they don't even have to take the syrup very far because bordering provinces have free markets. So get it over the border and it's questionable if you're even breaking the law or a rule. Richard had been caught as a barrel roller and paid to that point $1.5 million in fines to the Federation for illegally selling maple syrup. Avik Caron was another person the authorities set their sights on. Avik was actually the owner of the St. Louis de Blandford warehouse, and the Federation had come to Avik in 2011, asking to rent part of his warehouse to store their strategic reserve. The man with the insider access they had suspected all along. Avik knew nothing about maple syrup, but he knew it was a golden liquid gold mine. And he knew that he needed someone to help him with the logistics of selling maple syrup on the black market. He actually had a mutual friend with Richard, whose name was Sébastien Jutrust, and thus the planning began. Avik was the warehouse guy. Sebastien was the driver, and Richard was the processor and seller, sending the stolen maple syrup to Germany, Japan, and the United States via an exporter named Etienne St. Pierre, who lived in a neighboring province. Eventually, 26 people would face charges in connection with the Great Maple Syrup Heist of 2012, which included conspiracy, theft, fraud, and trafficking in stolen goods. I don't know much about what happened with the rest of these charged folks, but what I do know is that Sebastien would eventually testify against Richard, Avik, and Etienne. He would say that the men really considered themselves more like Robin Hood rather than, I guess, a Billy the Kid. He would say that the men believed, quote, stealing from thieves is not stealing, end quote. While the maple syrup was running in March 2012, Sebastien, Richard, and 3 other suspected accomplices took a break. A souvenir beer bottle labeled with a photo of them partying in Cancun was shown to the jury. The TV news announced 6 months later that the Federation had found out it had been the target of a significant heist. Richard's remark, according to Sebastien's testimony, was brief. Quote, "The party's over," end quote. Richard Vallier was found guilty and sentenced to 8 years in prison in 2018 following a lengthy trial. He may face 6 years more if he can't pay the 9.4 million Canadian dollars in reparations he's been ordered to pay. Avik Caron was sentenced to 6 years in prison in order to pay a 1.7 million Canadian dollar fine. Etienne St. Pierre was given a $1 million fine and sentenced to 2 years of home confinement. Additionally, Richard's dad, Raymond, was also sentenced to 2 years home confinement for his role in the crime, which I'm guessing involved helping with the processing of the syrup, but to be honest, I'm not really sure. Maple syrup tends to be a family business in Quebec. His conviction was for possession, which I'm assuming is possession of syrup. Canada's weird. Sebastien Jutras served just 8 months in prison, probably because he squealed on his sticky-fingered friends. Etienne contends he's broken no laws and blames the Federation of Maple Syrup Producers itself. In fact, many people admire the plot and the men who committed the crimes and put all the blame on the Federation. At least one syrup producer said the Federation, quote, will turn us all into criminals, end quote. Richard may get out of jail this year if he can pay his fine, but the Federation, much to his and at least some other maple syrup producer's chagrin, will still be very much around. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'm not always the biggest fan of bourbon drinks, but I think this is a good one. Try it out. A few of my sources for this upload I would highly recommend, by the way. First, I'll just throw out a plug for an episode of a Netflix series called Dirty Money. They covered this case and the Federation of Maple Syrup Producers in 2020. I mean, I don't think Netflix needs any help from me, but if you need a recommendation, well, this was a good one. Also, a lot of my cases this season come from a fun book called Heist by Peter Stegemeyer, which I've linked in the description box as well. Make sure to follow me on social media, especially X or Twitter or whatever it's called these days. Twitter is very unhinged and also sometimes is like the wall of a bar bathroom, but I am on there a fair amount, retweeting funny crime memes or even sometimes some tweets about serious cases. Can we even call them tweets? Like, what do you call them? There will be an upload next Tuesday as an apology for missing the first Tuesday of this month. And we're headed back in time and across the pond for a historic prankster. Grab the ingredients for the drink this week, which you'll find in the description box, and then drink along. I'll see you next week. And remember, there are always alternatives to stealing millions of dollars worth of maple syrup to spite the cartel.